Welcome to KatuhClysmic's Cozy Corner, the series where I read public domain novels for you to listen to as you do chores, fall asleep, or simply move through your day. Today, I'm going to be reading A Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. If you're like me, you've seen just about every rendition of every movie adaptation ever made about this book, including the knockoffs of all knockoffs. I love the concept of the story, the idea of discovering some unknown land, going on an adventure, and following the instructions of an ancient text to find your way. There's something very Indiana Jones and Uncharted-esque about it. I've never read the original novel, and I wanted to see what it was all about. So, take a listen as I read to you A Journey to the Center of the Earth. P.S. This book will be divided into 4 separate parts. The first part is only the first 11 chapters. 3 additional parts, 11 chapters each, will follow. Thank you. Enjoy. Chapter 1. My uncle makes a great discovery. Looking back to all that has occurred to me since that eventful day, I am scarcely able to believe in the reality of my adventures. They were truly so wonderful that even now I am bewildered when I think of them. My uncle was a German, having married my mother's sister, an Englishwoman. Being very much attached to his fatherless nephew, he invited me to study under him in his home in the fatherland. This home was in a large town, and my uncle, a professor of philosophy, chemistry, geology, mineralogy, and many other ologies. One day, after passing some hours in the laboratory, my uncle being absent at the time, I suddenly felt the necessity of renovating the tissues, i.e., I was hungry, and was about to rouse up our old French cook, when my uncle, Professor von Hardwigg, suddenly opened the street door and came rushing upstairs. Now, Professor Hardwigg, my worthy uncle, is by no means a bad sort of man. He is, however, choleric and original. To bear with him means to obey, and scarcely had his heavy feet resounded within our joint domicile than he shouted for me to attend upon him. "Harry! Harry! Harry!" I hastened to obey, but before I could reach his room, jumping 3 steps at a time, he was stamping his right foot upon the landing. "Harry!" he cried in a frantic tone. "Are you coming up?" Now, to tell the truth, at that moment, I was far more interested in the question as to what was to constitute our dinner than in any problem of science. To me, soup was more interesting than soda, an omelette more tempting than arithmetic, and an artichoke of 10 times more value than any amount of asbestos. But my uncle was not a man to be kept waiting. So adjourning, therefore, all minor questions, I presented myself before him. He was a very learned man. Now, most persons in this category supply themselves with information, as peddlers do with goods, for the benefit of others, and lay up stores in order to diffuse them abroad for the benefit of society in general. Not so my excellent uncle, Professor Hardwigg. He studied, he consumed the midnight oil, he pored over heavy tomes and digested huge quartos and folios in order to keep the knowledge acquired to himself. There was a reason, and it may be regarded as a good one, why my uncle objected to display his learning more than was absolutely necessary. He stammered, and when intent upon explaining the phenomena of the heavens was apt to find himself at fault, and allude in such a vague way to sun, moon, and stars that few were able to comprehend his meaning. To tell the honest truth, when the right word would not come, it was generally replaced by a very powerful adjective. In connection with the sciences, there are many almost unpronounceable names very much resembling those of Welsh villages, and my uncle, being very fond of using them, his habit of stammering was not thereby improved. In fact, there were periods in his discourse when he would finally give up and swallow his discomfiture in a glass of water. As I said, my uncle, Professor Hardwigg, was a very learned man, and I now add a most kind relative. I was bound to him by the double ties of affection and interest. I took deep interest in all his doings, and hoped someday to be almost as learned myself. It was a rare thing for me to be absent from his lectures. Like him, I preferred mineralogy to all other sciences. My anxiety was to gain real knowledge of the earth. Geology and mineralogy were to us the sole objects of life, and in connection with these studies may a fair specimen of stone, chalk, or metal did we break with our hammers. Steel rods, lodestones, glass pipes, and bottles of various acids were oftener before us than our meals. My Uncle Hardwigg was once known to classify 600 different geological specimens by their weight, hardness, fusibility, sound, taste, and smell. He corresponded with all the great, learned, and scientific men of the age. I was, therefore, in constant communication with, at all events, the letters of Sir Humphrey Davy, Captain Franklin, and other great men. But before I state the subject on which my uncle wished to confer with me, I must say a word about his personal appearance. Alas, my readers will see a very different portrait of him at a future time, after he has gone through the fearful adventures yet to be related. My uncle was 50 years old. Tall, thin, and wiry. Large spectacles hid to a certain extent his vast, round, and goggle eyes, while his nose was irreverently compared to a thin file. So much indeed did I resemble that useful article that a compass was said in his presence to have made considerable nasal deviation. The truth being told, however, the only article really attracted to my uncle's nose was tobacco. Another peculiarity of his was that he always stepped a yard at a time, clenched his fists as if he were going to hit you, and was, when in one of his peculiar humors, very far from a pleasant companion. It is further necessary to observe that he lived in a very nice house, in that very nice street, the Königstrasse at Hamburg. Though lying in the center of town, it was perfectly rural in its aspect, half wood, half bricks, with old-fashioned gables, one of the few old houses spared by the Great Fire of 1842. When I say a nice house, I mean a handsome house, old, tottering, and not exactly comfortable to English notions, a house a little off the perpendicular, and inclined to fall into the neighboring canal, exactly the house for a wandering artist to depict. All the more that you could scarcely see it for ivy and a magnificent old tree which grew over the door. My uncle was rich. His house was his own property, while he had a considerable private income. To my notion, the best part of his possessions was his goddaughter, Gretchen, and the old cook, the young lady, the professor, and I were the sole inhabitants. I loved mineralogy. I loved geology. To me, there was nothing like pebbles, and if my uncle had been in a little less of a fury, we should have been the happiest of families. To prove the excellent Hardwigg's impatience, I solemnly declare that when the flowers in the drawing-room pots began to grow, he rose every morning at 4 o'clock to make them grow quicker, by pulling the leaves. Having described my uncle, I will now give an account of our interview. He received me in his study, a perfect museum containing every natural curiosity that can well be imagined, minerals, however, predominating. Every one was familiar to me, having been catalogued by my own hand. My uncle, apparently oblivious of the fact that he had summoned me to his presence, was absorbed in a book. He was particularly fond of early editions, tall copies, and unique works. "Wonderful!" he cried, tapping his forehead. "Wonderful! Wonderful!" It was one of those yellow-leaved volumes now rarely found on stalls, and to me it appeared to possess but little value. My uncle, however, was in raptures. He admired its binding, the clearness of its characters, the ease with which it opened in his hand, and repeated aloud 6 times that it was very, very old. To my fancy, he was making a great fuss about nothing, but it was not my province to say so. On the contrary, I professed considerable interest in the subject, and asked him what it was about. "It is the Heimskringla of Snorre Tarlson," he said, "the celebrated Icelandic author of the 12th century. It is a true and correct account of the Norwegian princes who reigned in Iceland." My next question related to the language in which it was written. I hoped, at all events, it was translated into German. My uncle was indignant at the very thought, and declared he wouldn't give a penny for a translation. His delight was to have found the original work in the Icelandic tongue, which he declared to be one of the most magnificent and yet simple idioms in the world, while at the same time its grammatical combinations were the most varied known to students. "About as easy as German?" was my insidious remark. My uncle shrugged his shoulders. "The letters, at all events," I said, "are rather difficult of comprehension. It is a runic manuscript, the language of the original population of Iceland, invented by Odin himself," cried my uncle, angry at my ignorance. I was about to venture upon some misplaced joke on the subject when a small scrap of parchment fell out of the leaves. Like a hungry man snatching at a morsel of bread, the professor seized it. It was about 5 inches by 3 and was scrawled over in the most extraordinary fashion. The lines shown here were an exact facsimile of what was written on the venerable piece of parchment, and have wonderful importance as they induced my uncle to undertake the most wonderful series of adventures which ever fell to the lot of human beings. My uncle looked keenly at the document for some moments, and then declared that it was runic. The letters were similar to those in the book. But then, what did they mean? This was exactly what I wanted to know. Now, as I had a strong conviction that the runic alphabet and dialect were simply an invention to mystify poor human nature, I was delighted to find that my uncle knew as much about the matter as I did, which was nothing. At all events, the tremulous motion of his fingers made me think so. And yet, he muttered to himself, it is old Icelandic, I'm sure of it, and my uncle ought to have known, for he was a perfect polyglot dictionarian himself. He did not pretend, like a certain learned pundit, to speak the 2,000 languages and 4,000 idioms made use of in different parts of the globe, but he did know all the more important ones. It is a matter of great doubt to me now to what violent measures my uncle's impetuosity might have led him, had not the clock struck 2, and our old French cook called out to let us know that dinner was on the table. "Bother the dinner," cried my uncle, but as I was hungry, I sailed forth to the dining room, where I took up my usual quarters. Out of politeness, I waited 3 minutes, but no sign of my uncle the professor. I was surprised. He was not usually so blind to the pleasure of a good dinner. It was the acme of German luxury. Parsley soup, a ham omelette with sorrel trimmings, an oyster of veal stewed with prunes, delicious fruit, and sparkling moselle. For the sake of poring over this musty old piece of parchment, my uncle forbore to share our meal. To satisfy my conscience, I ate for both. The old cook and housekeeper was nearly out of her mind. After taking so much trouble to find her master not appear at dinner was to her a sad disappointment, which, as she occasionally watched the havoc I was making on the viands, became also alarm. If my uncle were to come to table after all? Suddenly, just as I had consumed the last apple and drunk the last glass of wine, a terrible voice was heard at no great distance. It was my uncle, roaring for me to come to him. I made very nearly one leap of it, so loud, so fierce was his tone. Chapter 2. The Mysterious Parchment. "I declare," cried my uncle, striking the table fiercely with his fist, "I declare to you it is runic, and contains some wonderful secret which I must get at any price." I was about to reply when he stopped me. "Sit down," he said quite fiercely, "and write to my dictation." I obeyed. "I will substitute," he said, "a letter of our alphabet for that of the runic. We will then see what that will produce. Now, begin, and make no mistakes." The dictation commenced with the following incomprehensible result. Scarcely giving me time to finish, my uncle snatched the document from my hands and examined it with the most rapt and deep attention. "I should like to know what it means," he said, after a long period. Certainly I could not tell him, nor did he expect me to, his conversation being uniformly answered by himself. "I declare it puts me in mind of a cryptograph," he cried, "unless, indeed, the letters have been written without any real meaning. And yet, why take so much trouble? Who knows but I may be on the verge of some great discovery?" My candid opinion was that it was all rubbish, but this opinion I kept carefully to myself, as my uncle's choler was not pleasant to bear. All this time he was comparing the book with the parchment. "The manuscript volume and the smaller document are written in different hands," he said. "The cryptograph is of much later date than the book. There's an undoubted proof of the correctness of my surmise. An irrefragable proof, I took it to be. The first letter is a double M, which was only added to the Icelandic language in the 12th century. This makes the parchment 200 years posterior to the volume. The circumstances appeared very probable and very logical, but it was all surmise to me. To me, it appears probable that this sentence was written by some owner of the book. Now, who was the owner is the next most important question. Perhaps, by great good luck, it may be written somewhere in the volume. With these words, Professor Hardwigg took off his spectacles and, taking a powerful magnifying glass, examined the book carefully. On the flyleaf was what appeared to be a blot of ink, but on examination proved to be a line of writing almost effaced by time. This was what he sought, and after some considerable time, he made out these letters. Arn Saknussemm, he cried in a joyous, triumphant tone. That is not only an Icelandic name, but of a learned professor of the 16th century, a celebrated alchemist. I bowed as a sign of respect. These alchemists, he continued, Avicenna, Bacon, Lully, Paracelsus, were the only learned men of the day. They made surprising discoveries. May not this Saknussemm, nephew mine, have hidden on this bit of parchment some astounding invention? I believe the cryptograph to have a profound meaning, which I must make out. My uncle walked about the room in a state of excitement, almost impossible to describe. It may be so, sir, I timidly observed, but why conceal it from posterity? If it be useful, a worthy discovery. Why? How should I know? Did not Galileo make a secret of his discoveries in connection with Saturn? But we shall see. Until I discover the meaning of this sentence, I will neither eat nor sleep. My dear uncle, I began. Nor you neither, he added. It was lucky I had taken double allowance that day. In the first place, he continued, there must be a clue to the meaning. If we could find it, the rest would be easy enough. I began seriously to reflect. The prospect of going without food and sleep was not a promising one, so I determined to do my best to solve the mystery. My uncle, meanwhile, went on with his soliloquy. The way to discover it is easy enough. In this document, there are 132 letters, giving 79 consonants to 53 vowels. This is about the proportion found in most southern languages, the idioms of the north being much more rich in consonants. We may confidently predict, therefore, that we have to deal with a southern dialect. Nothing could be more logical. Now, said Professor Hardwigg, to trace the particular language. As Shakespeare says, that is the question, was my rather satirical reply. This man, Saknussemm, he continued, was a very learned man. Now, as he did not write in the language of his birthplace, he probably, like most learned men of the 16th century, wrote in Latin. If, however, I prove wrong in this guess, we must try Spanish, French, Italian, Greek, and even Hebrew. My own opinion, though, is decidedly in favor of Latin. This proposition startled me. Latin was my favorite study, and it seemed sacrilege to believe this gibberish to belong to the country of Virgil. Barbarous Latin, in all probability, continued my uncle, but still Latin. Very probably, I replied, not to contradict him. Let us see into the matter, continued my uncle. Here, you see we have a series of 132 letters, apparently thrown pell-mell upon paper without method or organization. There are words which are composed wholly of consonants, such as mm.rnlls, others which are nearly all vowels, the fifth, for instance, which is antf, and one of the last, osebo. This appears an extraordinary combination. Probably we shall find that the phrase is arranged according to some mathematical plan. No doubt a certain sentence has been written out and then jumbled up. Some plan to which some figure is the clue. Now, Harry, to show your English wit, what is that figure? I could give him no hint. My thoughts were indeed far away. While he was speaking, I had caught sight of the portrait of my cousin Gretchen, and was wondering when she would return. We were affianced, and loved one another very sincerely, but my uncle, who never thought even of such sublunary matters, knew nothing of this. Without noticing my abstraction, the professor began reading the puzzling cryptograph all sorts of ways, according to some theory of his own. Presently, rousing my wandering attention, he dictated one precious attempt to me. I mildly handed it over to him. It read as follows. I could scarcely keep from laughing, while my uncle, on the contrary, got in a towering passion, struck the table with his fist, darted out of the room, out of the house, and then, taking to his heels, was presently lost to sight. Chapter 3. An Astounding Discovery. What is the matter? Cried the cook, entering the room. When will master have his dinner? Never. And his supper? I don't know. He says he will eat no more, neither shall I. My uncle has determined to fast, and make me fast until he makes out this abominable inscription, I replied. You will be starved to death, she said. I was very much of the same opinion, but not liking to say so, sent her away, and began some of my usual work of classification. But try as I might, nothing could keep me from thinking alternately of the stupid manuscript and of the pretty Gretchen. Several times I thought of going out, but my uncle would have been angry at my absence. At the end of an hour, my allotted task was done. How to pass the time? I began by lighting my pipe. Like all other students, I delighted in tobacco, and seating myself in the great armchair, I began to think. Where was my uncle? I could easily imagine him tearing along some solitary road, gesticulating, talking to himself, cutting the air with his cane, and still thinking of the absurd hieroglyphics. Would he hit upon some clue? Would he come home in better humor? While these thoughts were passing through my brain, I mechanically took up the execrable puzzle and tried every imaginable way of grouping the letters. I put them together by 2s, by 3s, by 4s and 5s. In vain. Nothing intelligible came out, except that the 14th, 15th, and 16th made ice in English. The 84th, 85th, and 86th, the word sir. Then at last I seemed to find the Latin words rota, mutable, era, neck, atra. Ha! There seems to be some truth in my uncle's notion, thought I. Then again, I seemed to find the word luco, which means sacred wood. Then in the third line I appeared to make out labiled, a perfect Hebrew word, and at the last the syllables mir, ar, mur, which are French. And at the last the syllables mir, ar, mur, which were French. It was enough to drive one mad. 4 different idioms in this absurd phrase. What connection could there be between ice, sir, anger, cruel, sacred wood, changing, mother, are, and sea? The first and the last might, in a sentence connected with Iceland, mean sea of ice. But what of the rest of this monstrous cryptograph? I was, in fact, fighting against an insurmountable difficulty. My brain was almost on fire. My eyes were strained with staring at the parchment. The whole absurd collection of letters appeared to dance before my vision in a number of black little groups. My mind was possessed with temporary hallucination. I was stifling. I wanted air. Mechanically, I fanned myself with the document, of which now I saw the back and then the front. Imagine my surprise when, glancing at the back of the wearisome puzzle, the ink having gone through, I clearly made out Latin words, and among others, craterum and terrestri. I had discovered the secret. It came upon me like a flash of lightning. I had got the clue. All you had to do to understand the document was to read it backwards. All the ingenious ideas of the professor were realized. He had dictated it rightly to me. By a mere accident, I had discovered what he so much desired. My delight, my emotion may be imagined. My eyes were dazzled, and I trembled so that at first I could make nothing of it. One look, however, would tell me all I wished to know. Let me read, I said to myself, after drawing a long breath. I spread it before me on the table. I passed my finger over each letter. I spelled it through. In my excitement, I read it out. What horror and stupefaction took possession of my soul. I was like a man who had received a knockdown blow. Was it possible that I really read the terrible secret? And it had really been accomplished? A man had dared to do what? No living being should ever know. Never, I cried, jumping up. Never shall my uncle be made aware of the dread secret. He would be quite capable of undertaking the terrible journey. Nothing would check him, nothing stop him. Worse, he would compel me to accompany him, and we should be lost forever. But no, such folly and madness cannot be allowed. I was almost beside myself with rage and fury. My worthy uncle is already nearly mad, I cried aloud. This would finish him. By some accident he may make the discovery, in which case we are both lost. Perish the fearful secret. Let the flames forever bury it in oblivion. I snatched up book and parchment, and was about to cast them into the fire when the door opened and my uncle entered. I had scarcely time to put down the wretched documents before my uncle was by my side. He was profoundly absorbed. His thoughts were evidently bent on the terrible parchment. Some new combination had probably struck him while taking his walk. He seated himself in his armchair, and with a pen, began to make an algebraical calculation. I watched him with anxious eyes. My flesh crawled as it became probable that he would discover the secret. His combinations, I knew now, were useless, I having discovered the one only clue. For 3 mortal hours he continued without speaking a word, without raising his head, scratching, rewriting, calculating over and over again. I knew that in time, he must hit upon the right phrase. The letters of every alphabet have only a certain number of combinations, but then years might elapse before he would arrive at the correct solution. Still, time went on. Night came, the sounds in the streets ceased, and still my uncle went on, not even answering our worthy cook when she called us to supper. I did not dare to leave him, so I waved her away, and at last fell asleep on the sofa. When I awoke, my uncle was still at work. His red eyes, his pallid countenance, his matted hair, his feverish hands, his hectically flushed cheeks showed how terrible had been his struggle with the impossible, and what fearful fatigue he had undergone during that long, sleepless night. It made me quite ill to look at him, and my heart ached at his sufferings. He was so overcome by one idea that he could not even get in a passion. All his energies were focused on one point, and I knew that by speaking one little word, all this suffering would cease. I could not speak it. My heart was, nevertheless, inclining towards him. Why, then, did I remain silent, in the interest of my uncle himself? "Nothing shall make me speak," I muttered. "He will want to follow in the footsteps of the other. I know him well. His imagination is a perfect volcano, and to make his discoveries in the interests of geology he would sacrifice his life. I will therefore be silent, and strictly keep the secret I have discovered. To reveal it would be suicidal. He would not only rush himself to destruction, but drag me with him." I crossed my arms, looked another way, and smoked, resolved never to speak. When our cook wanted to go out to the market, or on any other errand, she found the front door locked and the key taken away. Was this done purposely or not? Surely Professor Hardwigg did not intend the old woman and myself to become martyrs to his obstinate will. Were we to be starved to death? A frightful recollection came to my mind. Once we had fed on bits and scraps for a week while he sorted some curiosities. It gave me the cramp even to think of it. I wanted my breakfast, and I saw no way of getting it. Still, my resolution held good. I would starve rather than yield, but the cook began to take me seriously to task. What was to be done? She could not go out, and I dared not. My uncle continued counting and writing. His imagination seemed to have translated him to the skies. He neither thought of eating nor drinking. In this way, 12 o'clock came round. I was hungry, and there was nothing in the house. The cook had eaten the last bit of bread. This could not go on. It did, however, until 2, when my sensations were terrible. After all, I began to think the document was absurd. Perhaps it might only be a gigantic hoax. Besides, some means would surely be found to keep my uncle back from attempting any such absurd expedition. On the other hand, if he did attempt anything so quixotic, I should not be compelled to accompany him. Another line of reasoning partially decided me. Very likely he would make the discovery himself, when I should have suffered starvation for nothing. Under the influence of hunger, this reasoning appeared admirable. I determined to tell all. The question now arose as to how it would be done. I was still dwelling on the thought when he rose and put on his hat. "What? Go out and lock us in? Never!" "Uncle," I began. He did not appear even to hear me. "Professor Hardwigg!" I cried. "What?" he retorted. "Did you speak? What about the key?" "What key? The key to the door?" "No, of these horrible hieroglyphics." He looked at me from under his spectacles and started at the odd expression on my face. Rushing forward, he clutched me by the arm and keenly examined my countenance. His very look was an interrogation. I simply nodded. With an incredulous shrug of the shoulders, he turned upon his heel. Undoubtedly, he thought I had gone mad. "I have made a very important discovery." His eyes flashed with excitement. His hand was lifted in a menacing attitude. For a moment, neither of us spoke. It is hard to say which was most excited. "You don't mean to say that you have any idea of the meaning of the scrawl?" "I do," was my desperate reply. "Look at the sentence as dictated by you." Well, but it means nothing, was the angry answer. Nothing if you read it from left to right. But mark, if from right to left. Backwards, cried my uncle, in wild amazement. Oh, most cunning Saknussemm, and I to be such a blockhead! He snatched up the document, gazed at it with haggard eye, and read it aloud, as I had done. It read as follows. In Sneffels Joculus, craterum chem delebat, umbra scartaris Juli, intra calendas descende, audas viator, et terrestre centrum attingis, cod feci, Arn Saknussemm. Which dog Latin being translated, read as follows. Descend into the center of Yakul of Sneffels, which of the... Descend into the crater of Yakul of Sneffels, which the shade of Scartaris caresses, before the calends of July, audacious traveler, and you will reach the center of the earth. I did it. Arn Saknussemm. My uncle leaped 3 feet from the ground with joy. He looked radiant and handsome. He rushed about the room, wild with delight and satisfaction. He knocked over tables and chairs. He threw his books about until at last, utterly exhausted, he fell into his armchair. What's o'clock? He asked. About 3? My dinner does not seem to have done me much good, he observed. Let me have something to eat. We can then start at once. Get my portmanteau ready. What for? And your own, he continued. We start at once. My horror may be conceived. I resolved, however, to show no fear. Scientific reasons were the only ones likely to influence my uncle. Now there were many against this terrible journey. The very idea of going down to the center of the earth was simply absurd. I determined, therefore, to argue the point after dinner. My uncle's rage was now directed against the cook for having no dinner ready. My explanation, however, satisfied him, and having gotten the key, she soon contrived to get sufficient to satisfy our voracious appetites. During the repast, my uncle was rather gay than otherwise. He made some of those peculiar jokes which belong exclusively to the learned. As soon, however, as dessert was over, he called me to his study. We each took a chair on opposite sides of the table. Henry, he said, in a soft and winning voice, I have always believed you ingenious, and you have rendered me a service never to be forgotten. Without you, this wondrous discovery would never have been made. It is my duty, therefore, to insist on your sharing the glory. He is in good humor, I thought. I'll soon let him know my opinion of the glory. In the first place, he continued, you must keep the whole affair a profound secret. There is no more envious race of men than scientific discoveries. Many would start on the same journey. At all events, we will be the first in the field. I doubt your having many competitors, was my reply. A man of real scientific acquirements would be delighted at the chance. We should find the perfect stream of pilgrims on the traces of Arn Saknussemm, if this document were once made public. But, my dear sir, is not this paper very likely to be a hoax? I urged. The book in which we find it is sufficient proof of its authenticity, he replied. I thoroughly allow that the celebrated professor wrote the lines, but only, I believe, as a kind of mystification, was my answer. Scarcely were the words out of my mouth when I was sorry I had uttered them. My uncle looked at me with a dark and gloomy scowl, and I began to be alarmed for the results of our conversation. His mood soon changed, however, and a smile took the place of a frown. We shall see, he remarked with decisive emphasis. But see, what is all this about Yakul and Sneffels and the Scartaris? I've never heard anything about them. The very point to which I am coming. I lately received from my friend Augustus Petermann of Leipzig a map. Take down the 3rd atlas from the 2nd shelf, Series Z, Plate 4. I rose, went to the shelf, and presently returned with the volume indicated. This, said my uncle, is one of the best maps of Iceland. I believe it will settle all your doubts, difficulties, and objections. With a grim hope to the contrary, I stooped over the map. Chapter 4. We start on the journey. You see, the whole island is composed of volcanoes, said the professor, and remarked carefully that they all bear the name of Yakul. The word is Icelandic and means a glacier. In most of the lofty mountains of that region, the volcanic eruptions come forth from icebound caverns, hence the name applied to every volcano on this extraordinary island. But what does this word Sneffels mean? To this question I expected no rational answer. I was mistaken. Follow my finger to the western coast of Iceland. There you see Reykjavik, its capital. Follow the direction of one of its innumerable fjords or arms of the sea, and what do you see below the 65th degree of latitude? A peninsula, very like a thigh bone in shape. And in the center of it, a mountain. Well, that's Sneffels. I had nothing to say. That is Sneffels, a mountain about 5,000 feet in height, one of the most remarkable in the whole island, and certainly doomed to be the most celebrated in the world, for through its crater we shall reach the center of the earth. Impossible, I cried, startled and shocked at the thought. Why impossible? Said the professor in his severest tones. Because its crater is choked with lava, by burning rocks, by infinite dangers. But if it be extinct, that would make a difference. Of course it would. There are about 300 volcanoes on the whole surface of the globe, but the greater number are extinct. Of these, Sneffels is one. No eruption has occurred since 1219. In fact, it has ceased to be a volcano at all. After this, what more could I say? Yes, I thought of another objection. But what is all this about Scartaris and the calends of July? My uncle reflected deeply. Presently, he gave forth the result of his reflections in a sententious tone. What appears obscure to you, to me, is light. This very phrase shows how particular Saknussemm is in his directions. The Sneffels mountain has many craters. He is careful, therefore, to point the exact one, which is the highway into the interior of the earth. He lets us know, for this purpose, that about the end of the month of June, the shadow of Mount Scartaris falls upon one crater. There can be no doubt about the matter. My uncle had an answer for everything. I accept all your explanations, I said. And Saknussemm is right. He found out the entrance to the bowels of the earth. He has indicated correctly, but that he or anyone else ever followed up on the discovery is madness to suppose. Why so, young man? All scientific teaching, theoretical, practical, shows it to be impossible. I cared nothing for theories, retorted my uncle. But is it not well known that heat increases 1 degree for every 70 feet you descend into the earth, which gives a fine idea of the central heat? All the matters which compose the globe are in a state of incandescence. Even gold, platinum, and the hardest rocks are in a state of fusion. What would become of us? Don't be alarmed at the heat, my boy. How so? Neither you nor anybody else know anything about the real state of the Earth's interior. All modern experiments tend to explode the older theories. Were any such heat to exist, the upper crust of the Earth would be shattered to atoms, and the world would be at an end. A long, learned, and not uninteresting discussion followed, which ended in this wise. I do not believe in the dangers and difficulties which you, Henry, seem to multiply, and the only way to learn is like Arne Saknussemm, to go and see. Well, I cried, overcome at last, let us go and see. Though how we can do that in the dark is another mystery. Fear nothing. We shall overcome these and many other difficulties. Besides, as we approach the center, I expect to find it luminous. Nothing is impossible. And now that we have come to a thorough understanding, not a word to any living soul. Our success depends upon secrecy and dispatch. Thus ended our memorable conference, which roused a perfect fever in me. Leaving my uncle, I went forth like one possessed. Reaching the banks of the Elbe, I began to think. Was all I had heard really and truly possible? Was my uncle in his sober senses? And could the interior of the earth be reached? Was I the victim of a madman, or was he a discoverer of rare courage and grandeur of conception? To a certain extent, I was anxious to be off. I was afraid my enthusiasm would cool. I determined to pack up at once. At the end of an hour, however, on my way home, I found that my feelings had very much changed. I'm all abroad, I cried. 'Tis a nightmare. I must have dreamed it. At this moment, I came face to face with Gretchen, whom I warmly embraced. So you have come to meet me? She said. How good of you. But what is the matter? Well, it was no use mincing the matter. I told her all. She listened with awe, and for some minutes she could not speak. Well, I at last said, rather anxiously, what a magnificent journey! If I were only a man, a journey worthy of the nephew of Professor Hardwigg. I should look upon it as an honor to accompany him. My dear Gretchen, I thought you would be the first to cry out against this mad enterprise. No, on the contrary, I glory in it. It is magnificent, splendid, an idea worthy of my father. Henry Lawson, I envy you. This was, as it were, conclusive, the final blow of all. When we entered the house, we found my uncle surrounded by workmen and porters who were packing up. He was pulling and hauling at a bell. Where have you been wasting your time? Your portmanteau is not packed. My papers are not in order. The precious tailor has not brought my clothes, nor my garters. The key of my carpet bag is gone. I looked at him, stupefied, and still he tugged away at the bell. We are really off, then, I said. Yes, of course. And yet you go out for a stroll, unfortunate boy. And when do we go? The day after tomorrow, at daybreak. I heard no more, but darted off to my little bedchamber and locked myself in. There was no doubt about it now. My uncle had been hard at work all afternoon. The garden was full of ropes, rope ladders, torches, gourds, iron clamps, crowbars, alpenstocks, and pickaxes, enough to load 10 men. I passed a terrible night. I was called early the next day to learn that the resolution of my uncle was unchanged and irrevocable. I also found my cousin, an affianced wife, as warm on the subject as was her father. Next day, at 5 o'clock in the morning, the post-chaise was at the door. Gretchen and the old cook received the keys of the house, and scarcely pausing to wish anyone goodbye, we started on our adventurous journey into the center of the earth. Chapter 5. First Lessons in Climbing. At Altona, a suburb of Hamburg, is the chief station of the Kiel Railway, which was to take us to the shores of the Belt. In 20 minutes from the moment of our departure, we were at Holstein, and our carriage entered the station. Our heavy luggage was taken out, weighed and labeled, and placed in a huge van. We then took our tickets, and exactly at 7 o'clock, were seated opposite each other in a first-class railway carriage. My uncle said nothing. He was too busy examining his papers, among which, of course, was the famous parchment, and some letters of introduction from the Danish consul, which were to pave the way to an introduction to the governor of Iceland. My only amusement was looking out of the window. But as we passed through a flat, though fertile country, this occupation was slightly monotonous. In 3 hours we reached Kiel, and our baggage was at once transferred to the steamer. We had now a day before us, a delay of about 10 hours. Which in fact put my uncle in a towering passion. We had nothing to do but to walk about the pretty town and bay. At length, however, we went on board, and at 10:30 we were steaming down the Great Belt. It was a dark night, with a strong breeze and a rough sea, nothing being visible but the occasional fires on shore, with here and there a lighthouse. At 7 in the morning we left Korsør, a little town on the western side of Sealand. Here we took another railway, which in 3 hours brought us to the capital, Copenhagen, where, scarcely taking time for refreshment, my uncle hurried out to present one of his letters of introduction. It was to the director of the Museum of Antiquities, who, having been informed that we were tourists bound for Iceland, did all he could to assist us. One wretched hope sustained me now. Perhaps no vessel was bound for such distant parts. Alas! A little Danish schooner, the Valkyrie, was to sail on the 2nd of June for Reykjavik. The captain, Bjarne, was on board, and was rather surprised at the energy and cordiality with which his future passenger shook him by the hand. To him, a voyage to Iceland was merely a matter of course. My uncle, on the other hand, considered the event of sublime importance. The honest sailor took advantage of the professor's enthusiasm to double the fare. On Tuesday morning at 7 o'clock, be on board, said Bjarne, handing us our receipts. Excellent, capital, glorious, remarked my uncle as we sat down to a late breakfast. Refresh yourself, my boy, and we will take a run through the town. Our meal concluded, we went to the Konge Natur, to the king's magnificent palace, to the beautiful bridge over the canal near the museum. to the immense cenotaph of Thorwaldsen with its hideous naval groups, to the castle of Rosenberg, and to all the other lions of the place, none of which my uncle even saw, so absorbed was he in the anticipated triumphs. But one thing struck his fancy, and that was a certain singular steeple situated on the island of Amak, which is the southeast quarter of the city of Copenhagen. My uncle at once ordered me to turn my steps that way, and accordingly we went on board the steam ferry boat which does duty on the canal, and very soon reached the noted dockyard quay. In the first instance we crossed some narrow streets, where we met numerous groups of galley slaves with parti-colored trousers, grey and yellow, working under the orders of the sticks of severe taskmakers, and finally reached the Vor Frelsers Kirk. This church exhibited nothing remarkable in itself. In fact, the worthy professor had only been attracted to it by one circumstance, which was that its rather elevated steeple started from a circular platform, after which there was an exterior staircase, which wound round to the very summit. "Let us ascend," said my uncle. "But I never could climb church towers," I cried. "I am subject to dizziness in my head." "The very reason why you should go up. I want to cure you of a bad habit. But, my good sir, I tell you to come. What is the use of wasting so much valuable time?" It was impossible to dispute the dictatorial commands of my uncle. I yielded with a groan. On payment of a fee, a verger gave us the key. He, for one, was not partial to the ascent. My uncle at once showed me the way, running up the steps like a schoolboy. I followed as well as I could, though no sooner was I outside the tower than my head began to swim. There was nothing of the eagle about me. The earth was enough for me. And no ambitious desire to soar ever entered my mind. Still, things did not go badly until I had ascended 150 steps and was near the platform when I began to feel the rush of cold air. I could scarcely stand when clutching the railings. I looked upwards. The railing was frail enough, but nothing of those which skirted the terrible winding staircase that appeared from where I stood to ascend to the skies. "Now then, Henry." "I can't do it," I cried, in accents of despair. "Are you, after all, a coward, sir?" said my uncle in a pitiless tone. "Go up, I say." To this there was no reply possible, and yet the keen air acted violently on my nervous system. Sky, earth, all seemed to swim round, while the steeple rocked like a ship. My legs gave way like those of a drunken man. I crawled upon my hands and knees. I hauled myself up slowly, crawling like a snake. Presently I closed my eyes and allowed myself to be dragged upwards. "Look around you," said my uncle in a stern voice. "Heaven knows what profound abysses you may have to look down. This is excellent practice." Slowly, and shivering all the while with cold, I opened my eyes. What then did I see? My first glance was upwards at the cold, fleecy clouds, which as by some optical delusion appeared to stand still, while the steeple, the weathercock, and our two selves were carried swiftly along. Far away on one side could be seen the grassy plain, while on the other lay the sea bathed in translucent light. The Sund, or Sound as we call it, could be discovered beyond the point of Elsinore, crowded with white sails which, at that distance, looked like the wings of seagulls, while to the east could be made out the far-off coast of Sweden. The whole appeared a magic panorama. But faint and bewildered as I was, there was no remedy for it. Rise and stand up I must. Despite any protestations, my first lesson lasted quite an hour. When nearly 2 hours later I reached the bosom of Mother Earth, I was like a rheumatic old man, bent double with pain. "Enough for one day," said my uncle, rubbing his hands. "We will begin again tomorrow." There was no remedy. My lessons lasted 5 days, and at the end of the period I ascended blithely enough, and found myself able to look down into the depths below without even winking, and with some degree of pleasure. Chapter 6. Our Voyage to Iceland. The hour of departure came at last. The night before, the worthy Mr. Thompson brought us the most cordial letters of introduction for Baron Tramp, Governor of Iceland, for M. Picturson, Coadjutor to the Bishop, and for M. Finsen, Mayor of the town of Reykjavik. In return, my uncle nearly crushed his hands, so warmly did he shake them. On the 2nd of the month, at 2 in the morning, our precious cargo of luggage was taken on board the good ship Valkyrie. We followed, and were very politely introduced by the captain to a small cabin with 2 standing bed places, neither very well ventilated nor very comfortable. But in the cause of science, men are expected to suffer. "Well, have we a fair wind?" cried my uncle, in his most mellifluous accents. "An excellent wind," replied Captain Bjarn. "We shall leave the Sound, going free with all sails set." A few minutes afterwards, the schooner started before the wind, under all the canvas she could carry, and entered the channel. An hour later, the capital of Denmark seemed to sink into the waves, and we were at no great distance from the coast of Elsinore. My uncle was delighted. For myself, moody and dissatisfied, I appeared almost to expect a glimpse of the ghost of Hamlet. "Sublime madman," thought I. "You doubtless would approve our proceedings. You might perhaps even follow us to the center of the earth, there to resolve your eternal doubts." But no ghost or anything else appeared upon the ancient walls. The fact is, the castle is much later than the time of the heroic Prince of Denmark. It is now the residence of the keeper of the Strait of the Sound, and through that sound more than 15,000 vessels of all nations pass every year. The castle of Kronborg soon disappeared in the murky atmosphere, as well as the tower of Helsingborg, which raises its head on the Swedish bank. And here the schooner began to feel in earnest the breezes of the Kattegat. The Valkyrie was swift enough, but with all sailing boats, there was the same uncertainty. Her cargo was coal, furniture, pottery, woolen clothing, and a load of corn. As usual, the crew was small, 5 Danes doing the whole of the work. "How long will the voyage last?" asked my uncle. "Well, I should think about 10 days, replied the skipper, "unless indeed we meet with some northeast gales along the Faroe Islands." "At all events, there will be no very considerable delay," cried the impatient professor. "No, Mr. Hardwigg," said the captain. "No fear of that. At all events, we shall get there some day." Towards evening, the schooner doubled Cape Skagen, the northernmost part of Denmark, crossed the Skagerrak during the night, skirted the extreme point of Norway through the gut of Cape Lindesnæs, and then reached the northern seas. 2 days later, we were not far from the coast of Scotland, somewhere near what Danish sailors call Peterhead, and then the Valkyrie stretched out direct for the Faroe Islands, between Orkney and Shetland. Our vessel now felt the full force of the ocean waves, and the wind shifting, we with great difficulty made the Faroe Islands. On the 8th day, the captain made out Mygines, the westernmost of the isles, and from that moment headed direct for Portland, a cape on the southern shores of the singular island for which we were bound. The voyage offered no incident worthy of record. I bore it very well, but my uncle, to his great annoyance and even shame, was remarkably seasick. This mal de mer troubled him more that it prevented him from questioning Captain Bjarn as to the subject of Sneffels, as to the means of communication, and the facilities of transport. All these explanations he had to adjourn to the period of his arrival. His time, meanwhile, was spent lying in bed, groaning and dwelling anxiously for the hoped for termination of the voyage. I didn't pity him. On the 11th day, we sighted Cape Portland, over which towered Mount Myrdal's Jökull, which, the weather being clearer, we made out very readily. The cape itself is nothing but a huge mount of granite, standing naked and alone to meet the Atlantic waves. The Valkyrie kept off the coast, steering to the westward. On all sides were to be seen whole schools of whales and sharks. After some hours we came in sight of a solitary rock in the ocean, forming a mighty vault, through which the foaming waves poured with intense fury. The islets of Westman appeared to leap from the ocean, being so low in the water as scarcely to be seen until you were right upon them. From that moment the schooner was steered to the westward in order to round Cape Reykjanes, the western point of Iceland. My uncle, to his great disgust, was unable to even crawl on deck, so heavy a sea was on, and thus lost the first view of the land of promise. 48 hours later, after a storm which drove us far to sea under bare poles, we came once more in sight of land, and were boarded by a pilot, who, after 3 hours of dangerous navigation, brought the schooner safely to an anchor in the bay of Faxa, before Reykjavik. My uncle came out of his cabin, pale, haggard, thin, but full of enthusiasm, his eyes dilated with pleasure and satisfaction. Nearly the whole population of the town was on foot to see us land. The fact was that scarcely any one of them but expected some goods by the periodical vessel. Professor Hardwigg was in haste to leave his prison, or rather, as he called it, his hospital. But before he attempted to do so, he caught hold of my hand, led me to the quarterdeck of the schooner, took my arm with his left hand and pointed inland with his right, over the northern part of the bay to where rose a high, two-peaked mountain, a double cone covered with eternal snow. "Behold," he whispered in an awe-stricken voice, "behold, Mount Sneffels!" Then, without further remark, he put his finger to his lips, frowned darkly, and descended into the small boat which awaited us. I followed, and in a few minutes we stood upon the soil of mysterious Iceland. Scarcely were we fairly on shore when there appeared before us a man of excellent appearance, wearing the costume of a military officer. He was, however, but a civil servant, a magistrate, the governor of the island, Baron Tramp. The professor knew whom he had to deal with. He therefore handed him the letters of Copenhagen, and a brief conversation in Danish followed, to which I, of course, was a stranger, and for very good reason, for I did not know the language in which they conversed. I afterwards heard, however, that Baron Tramp placed himself entirely at the beck and call of Professor Hardwigg. My uncle was most graciously received by M. Finson, the mayor, who, as far as costume went, was quite as military as the governor, but also from character and occupation, quite as pacific. As for his coadjutor, M. Picturson, he was absent on an episcopal visit to the northern portion of the diocese. We were therefore compelled to defer the pleasure of being presented to him. His absence was, however, more than compensated by the presence of M. Fredriksson, professor of natural science in the College of Reykjavik, a man of invaluable ability. This modest scholar spoke no languages save Icelandic and Latin. When therefore he addressed himself to me in the language of Horace, we at once came to understand one another. He was, in fact, the only person that I did thoroughly understand during the whole period of my residence in this benighted island. Out of 3 rooms of which his house was composed, 2 were placed at our service, and in a few hours we were installed with all our baggage, the amount of which rather astonished the simple inhabitants of Reykjavik. "Now, Harry," said my uncle, rubbing his hands, "Anne goes well. The worst difficulty is over now." "How's the worst difficulty over?" I cried in fresh amazement. "Doubtless. Here we are in Iceland. Nothing more remains but to descend into the bowels of the earth." "Well, sir, to a certain extent you're right. We have only to go down, but as far as I'm concerned, that is not the question. I want to know how we are to get up again." "That is the least part of the business, and does not in any way trouble me. In the meantime, there is not an hour to lose. I am about to visit the public library. Very likely I may find there some manuscripts from the hand of Saknussemm. I shall be glad to consult them." "In the meanwhile," I replied, "I will take a walk through the town." "Will you not likewise do so?" "I feel no interest in the subject," said my uncle. "What for me is curious in this island is not what is above the surface, but what is below." I bowed my way of reply, put on my hat and furred cloak, and went out. It was not an easy matter to lose oneself in the 2 streets of Reykjavik. I had therefore no need to ask my way. The town lies on a flat and marshy plain between 2 hills. A vast field of lava skirts it on one side, falling away in terraces toward the sea. On the other hand is the large bay of Faxa, bordered on the north by the enormous glacier of Sneffels, and in which bay the Valkyrie was then the only vessel at anchor. Generally, there were 1 or 2 English or French gunboats to watch and protect the fisheries of the offing. They were now, however, absent on duty. The longest of the streets in Reykjavik runs parallel to the shore. In this street, the merchants and traders live in wooden huts made with beams of wood, painted red, mere log hut, such as you find in the wilds of America. The other street, situated more to the west, runs toward a little lake between the residences of the bishop and the other personages not engaged in commerce. I had soon seen all I wanted of these weary and dismal thoroughfares. Here and there was a strip of discolored turf, like an old worn-out bit of woolen carpet, and now and then a bit of kitchen garden, in which grew potatoes, cabbage, and lettuce, almost diminutive enough to suggest the idea of Lilliput. In the center of the new commercial street, I found the public cemetery, enclosed by an earthen wall. Though not very large, it appeared not likely to be filled for centuries. From hence, I went to the house of the governor, a mere hut in comparison to the mansion house of Hamburg, but a palace alongside the other Icelandic houses. Between the little lake and the town was the church, built in simple Protestant style and composed of calcined stones thrown up by volcanic action. I had not the slightest doubt that in high winds its red tiles were blown out, to the great annoyance of the pastor and congregation. Upon an eminence close at hand was the national school, in which were taught Hebrew, English, French, and Danish. In 3 hours my tour was complete. The general impression upon my mind was sadness. No trees, no vegetation, so to speak, on all sides volcanic peaks, the huts of turf and earth more like roofs than houses. Thanks to the heat of the residences, grass grows on the roof, which grass is carefully cut for hay. I saw but few inhabitants during my excursion, but I met a crowd on the beach, drying, salting, and loading codfish, the principal article of exportation. The men appeared robust but heavy, fair-haired like Germans, but of pensive mien. Exiles of a higher scale in the ladder of humanity than the Eskimos, but, I thought, much more unhappy, since with superior perceptions they were compelled to live within the limits of the polar circle. Sometimes they gave vent to a convulsive laugh, but by no chance did they smile. Their costume consists of a coarse capote of black wool, known in Scandinavian countries as the vadmel, a broad-brimmed hat, trousers of red serge, and a piece of leather tied with strings for a shoe. A coarse kind of moccasin. The women, though sad-looking and mournful, had rather agreeable features without much expression. They wear a bodice and petticoat of somber vadmel. When unmarried, they wear a little brown knitted cap over a crown of plaited hair, but when married, they cover their heads with a colored handkerchief, over which they tie a white scarf. Chapter 7. Conversation and Discovery. When I returned, dinner was ready. This meal was devoured by my worthy relative with avidity and voracity. His shipboarded diet had turned his interior into a perfect gulf. The repast, which was more Danish than Icelandic, was in itself nothing, but the excessive hospitality of our host made us enjoy it doubly. The conversation turned upon scientific matters, and M. Fredrickson asked my uncle what he thought of the public library. "Library, sir," cried my uncle. "It appears to me a collection of useless old volumes, and a beggarly amount of empty shelves." "What?" cried M. Fredrickson. "Why, we have 8,000 volumes of most rare and valuable works, some in the Scandinavian language, besides all the new publications from Copenhagen. 8,000 volumes, my dear sir. Why, where are they?" cried my uncle. "Scattered over the country, Professor Hardwigg. We are very studious, my dear sir, though we do live in Iceland. Every farmer, every laborer, every fisherman can both read and write. And we think that books, instead of being locked up in cupboards, far from the sight of students, should be distributed as widely as possible. The books of our library are therefore passed from hand to hand without returning to the library shelves perhaps for years." "Then, when foreigners visit you, there's nothing for them to see?" "Well, sir, foreigners have their own libraries, and our first consideration is that our humbler classes should be highly educated. Fortunately, the love of study is innate in the Icelandic people. In 1816, we founded a literary society and mechanics institute. Many foreign scholars of eminence are honorary members. We publish books destined to educate our people, and these books have rendered valuable services to our country. Allow me to have the honor, Professor Hardwigg, to enroll you as an honorary member." My uncle, who already belonged to nearly every literary and scientific institution in Europe, immediately yielded to the amiable wishes of good M. Fredrickson. "And now," he said, after many expressions of gratitude and goodwill, "if you will tell me what books you expected to find, perhaps I may be of some assistance to you." I watched my uncle keenly. For a minute or two he hesitated, as if unwilling to speak. To speak openly was, perhaps, to unveil his projects. Nevertheless, after some reflection, he made up his mind. "Well, M. Fredrickson," he said in an easy, unconcerned kind of way, "I was desirous of ascertaining if, among other valuable works, you had any of the learned Arne Saknussemm?" "Arne Saknussemm!" cried the professor of Reykjavik. You speak of one of the most distinguished scholars of the 16th century, of the great naturalist, the great alchemist, the great traveler. Exactly so. One of the most distinguished men connected with Icelandic science and literature. As you say, sir, a man illustrious above all. Yes, sir, all this is true, but his works? We have none of them. Not in Iceland? There are none in Iceland or elsewhere, answered the other sadly. Why so? Because Arne Saknussemm was persecuted for heresy, and in 1573 his works were publicly burnt at Copenhagen by the hands of the common hangman. Very good! Capital! Murmured my uncle, to the great astonishment of the worthy Icelander. You said, sir, yes, all is clear. I see the link in the chain. Everything is explained, and I now understand why Arne Saknussemm, put out of court, forced to hide his magnificent discoveries, was compelled to conceal beneath the veil of an incomprehensible cryptograph the secret— What secret? A secret which— stammered my uncle. Have you discovered some wonderful manuscript? Cried M. Fredrickson. No, I was carried away by my enthusiasm. A mere supposition. Very good, sir. But really, to turn to another subject, I hope you will not leave our island without examining into its mineralogical riches. Well, the fact is I am rather late. So many learned men have been here before me. Yes, but there is still much to be done, cried M. Fredrickson. You think so? Said my uncle, his eyes twinkling with hidden satisfaction. Yes, you have no idea how many unknown mountains, glaciers, volcanoes there are, which remain to be studied. Without moving from where we sit, I can show you one. Yonder, on the edge of the horizon, you see Sneffels. Oh yes, Sneffels, said my uncle. One of the most curious volcanoes in existence, the crater of which has only rarely been visited. Extinct? Extinct, any time these 500 years, was the ready reply. Well, said my uncle, who dug his nails into his flesh and pressed his knees tightly together to prevent himself leaping up with joy, I have a great mind to begin my studies with an examination of the geological mysteries of this Mount Sneffel. Faisal, what do you call it? Sneffels, my dear sir. This portion of the conversation took place in Latin, and I therefore understood all that had been said. I could scarcely keep my countenance when I found my uncle so cunningly concealing his delight and satisfaction. I must confess that his artful grimaces put on to conceal his happiness made him look like a new Mephistopheles. Yes, he continued, your proposition delights me. I will endeavor to climb to the summit of Sneffels, and, if possible, will descend into its crater. I very much regret, continued M. Fredrickson, that my occupation will entirely preclude the possibility of my accompanying you. It would have been both pleasurable and profitable if I could have spared the time. No, 1,000 times no, cried my uncle. I do not wish to disturb the serenity of any man. I thank you, however, with all my heart. The presence of one so learned as yourself would no doubt have been most useful, but the duties of your office and profession before everything. In the innocence of his simple heart, our host did not perceive the irony of these remarks. I entirely approve your project, continued the Icelander after some further remarks. It is a good idea to begin by examining this volcano. You will make a harvest of curious observations. In the first place, how do you propose to get to Sneffels? By sea. I shall cross the bay. Of course, that is the most rapid route. Of course, but still it cannot be done. Why? We have not an available boat in all Reykjavik, replied the other. What is to be done? You must go by land, along the coast. It is longer, but much more interesting. Then I must have a guide. Of course, and I have your very man. Somebody on whom I can depend. Yes, an inhabitant of the peninsula on which Sneffels is situated. He is a very shrewd and worthy man, with whom you will be pleased. He speaks Danish, like a Dane. When can I see him? Today? No, tomorrow. He will not be here before. Tomorrow be it, replied my uncle with a deep sigh. The conversation ended by compliments on both sides. During the dinner, my uncle had learned much as to the history of Arne Saknussemm, the reasons for his mysterious and hieroglyphical document. He also became aware that his host would not accompany him on his adventurous expedition, and that next day we should have a guide. Chapter 8. The Eiderdown Hunter Off at Last. That evening I took a brief walk on the shore near Reykjavik. after which I returned to an early sleep on my bed of coarse planks where I slept the sleep of the just. When I awoke, I heard my uncle speaking loudly in the next room. I rose hastily and joined him. He was talking in Danish with a man of tall stature and of perfectly Herculean build. This man appeared to be possessed of great strength. His eyes, which started rather prominently from a very large head, the face belonging to which was simple and naive, appeared very quick and intelligent. Very long hair, which even in England would have been accounted exceedingly red, fell over his athletic shoulders. This native of Iceland was active and supple in appearance, though he scarcely moved his arms, being in fact one of those men who despise the habit of gesticulation common to southern people. Everything in this man's manner revealed a calm and phlegmatic temperament. There was nothing indolent about him, but his appearance spoke of tranquility. He was one of those who never seemed to expect anything from anybody, who liked to work when he thought proper, and whose philosophy nothing could astonish or trouble. I began to comprehend his character, simply from the way in which he listened to the wild and impassioned verbiage of my worthy uncle. While the excellent professor spoke sentence after sentence, he stood with folded arms, utterly still, motionless to all my uncle's gesticulations. When he wanted to say no, he moved his head from left to right. When he acquiesced, he nodded, so slightly that you could scarcely see the undulation of his head. This economy of motion was carried to the length of avarice. Judging from his appearance, it should have been a long time before I had suspected him to be what he was, a mighty hunter. Certainly his manner was not likely to frighten the game. How, then, did he contrive to get at his prey? My surprise was slightly modified when I knew that this tranquil and solemn personage was only a hunter of the eider duck, the down of which is, after all, the greatest source of the Icelanders' wealth. In the early days of summer, the female of the eider, a pretty sort of duck, builds its nest amid the rocks of the fjords, the name given to all narrow gulfs in Scandinavian countries, with which every part of the island is indented. No sooner has the eider duck made her nest than she lines the inside of it with the softest down from her breast. Then comes the hunter, or trader, taking away the nest. The poor bereaved female begins her task over again, and this continues as long as any eider down is to be found. When she can find no more, the male bird sets to work to see what he can do. As, however, his down is not so soft and has therefore no commercial value, the hunter does not take the trouble to rob him of his nest lining. The nest is accordingly finished. The eggs are laid, the little ones are born, and next year the harvest of eider down is again collected. Now, as the eider duck never selects steep rocks or aspects to build its nest, but rather sloping and low cliffs near to the sea, the Icelandic hunter can carry on his trade operations without much difficulty. He is like a farmer who has neither to plow, to sow, nor to harrow, only to collect his harvest. This grave, sententious, silent person, as phlegmatic as an Englishman on the French stage, was named Hans Bjelke. He had called upon us in consequence of the recommendation of M. Fredriksson. He was, in fact, our future guide. It struck me that had I sought the world over, I could not have found a greater contradiction to my impulsive uncle. They, however, readily understood one another. Neither of them had any thought about money. One was ready to take all that was offered him, the other ready to offer anything that was asked. It may readily be conceived, then, that an understanding was soon come to between them. Now, the understanding was that he was to take us to the village of Stapi, situated on the southern slope of the peninsula of Sneffels, at the very foot of the volcano. Hans, the guide, told us the distance was about 22 miles, a journey which my uncle supposed would take about 2 days. But when my uncle came to understand that they were Danish miles of 8,000 yards each, he was obliged to be more moderate in his ideas, and considering the horrible roads we had to follow, to allow 8 or 10 days for the journey. 4 horses were prepared for us, 2 to carry the baggage, and 2 to bear the important weight of myself and uncle. Hans declared that nothing ever would make him climb on the back of any animal. He knew every inch of that part of the coast, and promised to take us the very shortest way. His engagement with my uncle was by no means to cease with our arrival at Stapi. He was further to remain in his service during the whole time required for the completion of his scientific investigations, at the fixed salary of 3 riksdaler a week, being exactly 14 shillings and 2 pence, minus 1 farthing, English currency. One stipulation, however, was made by the guide. The money was to be paid to him every Saturday night, failing which his engagement was at an end. The day of our departure was fixed. My uncle wished to hand the eiderdown hunter in advance, but he refused in one emphatic word, "Efter," which, being translated from Icelandic into plain English, means after. The treaty concluded, our worthy guide retired without another word. "A splendid fellow," said my uncle, "only he little suspects the marvelous part he is about to play in the history of the world." "You mean, then," I cried in amazement, "that he should accompany us?" "To the interior of the earth, yes," replied my uncle. "Why not?" There were yet 48 hours to elapse before we made our final start. To my regret, our whole time was taken up in making preparations for our journey. All our industry and ability were devoted to packing every object in the most advantageous manner, the instruments on one side, the arms on the other, the tools here and the provisions there. There were, in fact, 4 distinct groups. The instruments were, of course, the best manufacture. 1. A centigrade thermometer of Eigel, counting up to 150 degrees, which to me did not appear half enough, or too much. Too hot by half if the degree of heat was to ascend so high, in which case we should certainly be cooked. Not enough if we wanted to ascertain the exact temperature of springs or metal in the state of fusion. 2. A manometer worked by compressed air, an instrument used to ascertain the upper atmospheric pressure on the level of the ocean. Perhaps a common barometer would not have done as well, the atmospheric pressure being likely to increase in proportion as we descended below the surface of the earth. 3. A first-class chronometer. A first-class chronometer made by Boysanus of Geneva, set at the meridian of Hamburg, from which Germans calculate as the English do from Greenwich and the French from Paris. 4. 2 compasses, one for horizontal guidance, the other to ascertain the dip. 5. A night glass. 6. 2 Ruhmkorff coils, which by means of a current of electricity would ensure us a very excellent, easily carried and certain means of obtaining light. 7. A voltaic battery on the newest principle. Our arms consisted of 2 rifles, with 2 revolving 6-shooters. Why these arms were provided, it was impossible for me to say. I had every reason to believe that we had neither wild beasts nor natives to fear. My uncle, on the other hand, was quite as devoted to his arsenal as to his collection of instruments, and above all was very careful with his provision of fulminating or gun cotton, warranted to keep in any climate, and of which the expansive force was known to be greater than that of ordinary gunpowder. Our tools consisted of 2 pickaxes, 2 crowbars, a silken ladder, 3 iron-shod alpine poles, a hatchet, a hammer, a dozen wedges, some pointed pieces of iron, and a quantity of strong rope. You may conceive that the whole made a tolerable parcel, especially when I mention that the ladder itself was 300 feet long. Then there came the important question of provisions. The hamper was not very large, but tolerably satisfactory, for I knew that in concentrated essence of meat and biscuit there was enough to last 6 months. The only liquid provided by my uncle was scheidam, of water, not a drop. We had, however, an ample supply of gourds, and my uncle counted on finding water, and enough to fill them as soon as we commenced our downward journey. My remarks as to the temperature, the quality, and even as to the possibility of none being found remained wholly without effect. To make up the exact list of our traveling gear, for the guidance of future travelers, add that we carried a medicine and surgical chest with all apparatus necessary for wounds, fractures, and blows, lint, scissors, lancets, in fact a perfect collection of horrible-looking instruments, a number of vials containing ammonia, alcohol, ether, goloid water, aromatic vinegar, in fact every possible and impossible drug, finally all the materials for working the Ruhmkorff coil. My uncle had also been careful to lay in a goodly supply of tobacco, several flasks of very fine gunpowder, boxes of tinder, besides a large belt crammed full of notes and gold. Good boots rendered watertight were to be found to the number of 6 in the toolbox. "My boy, with such clothing, with such boots, and such general equipment," said my uncle in a state of rapturous delight, "we may hope to travel far." It took a whole day to put all these matters in order. In the evening we dined with Baron Tramp, in company with the mayor of Reykjavik, and Dr. Hjætelen, the great medical man of Iceland. N. Fredriksson was not present, and I was afterwards sorry to hear that he and the governor did not agree on some matters connected with the administration of the island. Unfortunately, the consequence was that I did not understand a word that was said at dinner. a kind of semi-official reception. One thing I can say, my uncle never left off speaking. The next day, our labor came to an end. Our worthy host delighted my uncle, Professor Hardwigg, by giving him a good map of Iceland, a most important and precious document for the mineralogist. Our last evening was spent in a long conversation with M. Fredrickson, whom I liked very much, the more that I never expected to see him or anyone else again. After this agreeable way of spending an hour or so, I tried to sleep. In vain. With the exception of a few dozes, my night was miserable. At 5 o'clock in the morning, I was awakened from the only real half-hour's sleep of the night by the loud neighing of horses under my window. I hastily dressed myself and went down into the street. Hans was engaged in putting the finishing stroke to our baggage, which he did in a silent, quiet way that won my admiration, and yet he did it admirably well. My uncle wasted a great deal of breath in giving him directions, but worthy Hans took not the slightest notice of his words. At 6 o'clock, all our preparations were completed, and M. Fredrickson shook hands heartily with us. My uncle thanked him warmly, in the Icelandic language, for his kind hospitality, speaking truly from the heart. As for myself, I put together a few of my best Latin phrases and paid him the highest compliments I could. This fraternal and friendly duty performed, we sallied forth and mounted our horses. As soon as we were quite ready, M. Fredrickson advanced, and by way of farewell, called after me in the words of Virgil, words which appeared to have been made for us, travelers starting for an uncertain destination. And whichsoever way thou goest, may fortune follow. Chapter 9. Our Start. We Meet with Adventures by the Way. The weather was overcast but settled when we commenced our adventurous and perilous journey. We had neither to fear fatiguing heat nor drenching rain. It was, in fact, real tourist weather. As there was nothing I liked better than horse exercise, the pleasure of riding through an unknown country caused the early part of our enterprise to be particularly agreeable to me. I began to enjoy the exhilarating delight of traveling, a life of desire, gratification, and liberty. The truth is that my spirits rose so rapidly that I began to be indifferent to what had once appeared to be a terrible journey. After all, I said to myself, what do I risk? Simply to take a journey through a curious country, to climb a remarkable mountain, and if the worst comes to worst, to descend into the crater of an extinct volcano. There could be no doubt that this was all this terrible Sagnussum had done. As to the existence of a gallery, or of subterraneous passages leading into the interior of the earth, the idea was simply absurd, the hallucination of a distempered imagination. All, then, that may be required of me I will do cheerfully, and will create no difficulty. It was just before we left Reykjavik that I came to this decision. Hans, our extraordinary guide, went first, walking with a steady, rapid, unvarying step. Our 2 horses with the luggage followed of their own accord, without requiring whip or spur. My uncle and I came behind, cutting a very tolerable figure upon our small but vigorous animals. Iceland is one of the largest islands in Europe. It contains 30,000 square miles of surface and has about 70,000 inhabitants. Geographers have divided it into 4 parts, and we had to cross the southwest quarter, which in the vernacular is called Sudvester Fjordunger. Hans, on taking his departure from Reykjavik, had followed the line of the sea. We took our way through poor and sparse meadows, which made a desperate effort every year to show a little green. They very rarely succeeded in a good show of yellow. The rugged summits of the rocky hills were dimly visible on the edge of the horizon, through the misty fogs. Every now and then, some heavy flakes of snow showed conspicuous in the morning light. While certain lofty and pointed rocks were first lost in the gray low clouds, their summits clearly visible above like jagged reefs rising from a troublous sea. Every now and then a spur of rock came down through the arid ground, leaving us scarcely room to pass. Our horses, however, appeared not only well acquainted with the country, but by a kind of instinct knew which was the best road. My uncle had not even the satisfaction of urging forward his steed by whip, spur, or voice. It was utterly useless to show any signs of impatience. I could not help smiling to see him look so big on his little horse. His long legs now and then touching the ground made him look like a 6-footed centaur. Good beast, he would cry. I assure you that I begin to think no animal is more intelligent than an Icelandic horse. Snow, tempest, impractical roads, rocks, icebergs, nothing stops him. He is brave, he is sober, he is safe. He never makes a false step, never glides or slips from his path. I dare to say that if any river, any fjord has to be crossed, and I have no doubt there will be many, you will see him enter the water without hesitation like an amphibious animal, and reach the opposite side in safety. We must not, however, attempt to hurry him. We must allow him to have his own way, and I will undertake to say that between us we shall do our 10 leagues a day." "We may do so," was my reply. "But what about our worthy guide?" "I have not the slightest anxiety about him. That sort of people go ahead without knowing even what they are about. Look at Hans. He moves so little that it is impossible for him to become fatigued. Besides, if he were to complain of weariness, he could have the loan of my horse. I should have a violent attack of the cramp if I were not to have some sort of exercise. My arms are right, but my legs are getting a little stiff." All this while we were advancing at a rapid pace. The country we had reached was already nearly a desert. Here and there could be seen an isolated farm, some solitary burr or Icelandic house built of wood, earth, fragments of lava, looking like beggars on the highway of life. These wretched and miserable huts excited in us such pity that we felt half disposed to leave alms at every door. In this country there are no roads. Paths are nearly unknown, and vegetation, poor as it was, slowly as it reached perfection, soon obliterated all traces of the few travelers who passed from place to place. Nevertheless, this division of the province, situated only a few miles from the capital, is considered one of the best cultivated and most thickly peopled in all Iceland. What, then, must be the state of the less known and more distant parts of the island? After traveling fully half a Danish mile, we had met neither a farmer at the door of his hut, nor even a wandering shepherd with his wild flock. A few stray cows and sheep were only seen occasionally. What, then, must we expect when we come to the upheaved regions, to the districts broken and roughened from volcanic eruptions and subterraneous commotions? We were to learn this all in good time. I saw, however, on consulting the map, that we avoided a good deal of this rough country by following the winding and desolate shores of the sea. In reality, the great volcanic movement of the island and all its attendant phenomena are concentrated in the interior of the island. There, horizontal layers of strata of rocks, piled upon one another, eruptions of basaltic origin, and streams of lava have given this country a kind of supernatural reputation. Little did I expect, however, the spectacle which awaited us when we reached the peninsula of Sneffels, where agglomerations of nature's ruins form a kind of terrible chaos. Some 2 hours or more after we had left the city of Reykjavik, we reached a little town called KatuhClysmic, or the principal church. It consists simply of a few houses, not what in England or Germany we should call a hamlet. Hans stopped here 1/2 hour. He shared our frugal breakfast, answered yes and no to my uncle's questions as to the nature of the road, and at last, when asked where we were to pass the night, was as laconic as usual. "Gardar," was his one-worded reply. I took occasion to consult the map, to see where Gardar was to be found. After looking keenly, I found a small town of that name on the borders of the Hvalfjord, about 4 miles from Reykjavik. I pointed this out to my uncle, who made a very energetic grimace. "Only 4 miles out of 22? Why, it is only a little walk." He was about to make some energetic observation to the guide, but Hans, without taking the slightest notice of him, went in front of the horses, and walked ahead with the same imperturbable phlegm he had always exhibited. 3 hours later, still traveling over those apparently interminable and sandy prairies, we were compelled to go round the Kollafjord, an easier and shorter cut than crossing the gulfs. Shortly after we entered a place of communal jurisdiction called Ejulberg, and the clock, of which would then have struck 12, if any Icelandic church had been rich enough to possess so valuable and useful an article. These sacred edifices are, however, very much like these people, who do without watches and never miss them. Here the horses were allowed to take some rest and refreshment, then, following a narrow strip of shore between high rocks and the sea, they took us without further halt to the Eolkirkja of Brantar, and after another mile, to Saubor and Exia, a chapel of ease, situated on the southern bank of the Hvalfjord. It was 4 o'clock in the evening, and we had traveled 4 Danish miles, about equal to 20 English. The fjord was in this place about half a mile in width. The sweeping and broken waves came rolling in upon the pointed rocks. The gulf was surrounded by rocky walls, a mighty cliff, 3,000 feet in height, remarkable for its brown strata, separated here and there by beds of tufa of reddish hue. Now, whatever may have been the intelligence of our horses, I had not the slightest reliance upon them, as a means of crossing a stormy arm of the sea. To ride over salty water upon the back of a little horse seemed to me absurd. If they are really intelligent, I said to myself, they will certainly not make the attempt. In any case, I shall trust rather to my own intelligence than theirs. But my uncle was in no humor to wait. He dug his heels into the sides of his steed and made for the shore. His horse went to the very edge of the water, sniffed at the approaching wave, and retreated. My uncle, who was, sooth to say, quite as obstinate as the beasts he bestrode, insisted on his making the desired advance. This attempt was followed by a new refusal on the part of the horse, which quietly shook his head. This demonstration of rebellion was followed by a volley of words and a stout application of whipcord, as followed by kicks on the part of the horse, which threw its head and heels upward and tried to throw his rider. At length, the sturdy little pony, spreading out his legs in a stiff and ludicrous attitude, got from under the professor's legs and left him standing, with both feet on a separate stone, like the Colossus of Rhodes. "Wretched animal!" cried my uncle, suddenly transformed into a foot passenger, and as angry and ashamed as a dismounted cavalry officer on the field of battle. "Fara," said the guide, tapping him familiarly on the shoulder. "What? A ferry boat?" "Der," answered Hans, pointing to where lay the boat in question. "There." "Well," I cried, delighted with the information, "so it is." "Why did you not say so before?" cried my uncle. "Why not start at once?" "Tid vatten," said the guide. "What does he say?" I asked, considerably puzzled by the delay in the dialogue. "He says tide," replied my uncle, translating the Danish word for my information. "Of course, I understand. We must wait till the tide serves." "Forbidda?" asked my uncle. "Ja," replied Hans. My uncle frowned, stamped his feet, and then followed the horses to where the boat lay. I thoroughly understood and appreciated the necessity for waiting before crossing the fjord, for that moment, when the sea at its highest point is in a state of slack water. As neither the ebb nor flow can then be felt, the ferry boat was in no danger of being carried out to sea or dashed upon the rocky coast. The favorable moment did not come until 6 o'clock in the evening. Then my uncle, myself, and guide, 2 boatmen, and the 4 horses got into a very awkward flat-bottomed boat. Accustomed as I had been to the steam ferry boats of the Elbe, I found the long oars of the boatmen but sorry means of locomotion. We were more than an hour in crossing the fjord, but at length the passage was concluded without accident. Half an hour later, we reached Gardar. Chapter 10. Traveling in Iceland. It ought, one would have thought, to have been night, even in the 65th parallel of latitude, but still the nocturnal illumination did not surprise me. For in Iceland, during the months of June and July, the sun never sets. The temperature, however, was very much lower than I expected. I was cold, but even that did not affect me so much as ravenous hunger. Welcome, indeed, therefore, was the hut which hospitably opened its doors to us. It was merely the house of a peasant, but in the matter of hospitality it was worthy of being the palace of a king. As we alighted at the door, the master of the house came forward, held out his hand, and without any further ceremony, signaled to us to follow him. We followed him, for to accompany him was impossible. A long, narrow, gloomy passage led into the interior of this habitation, made from beams roughly squared by the axe. This passage gave ingress to every room. The chambers were 4 in number: the kitchen, the workshop, where the weaving was carried on, the general sleeping chamber of the family, and the best room, to which strangers were especially invited. My uncle, whose lofty stature had not been taken into consideration when the house was built, contrived to knock his head against the beams of the roof. We were introduced into our chamber, a kind of large room with a hard earthen floor, and lighted by a window, the panes of which were made of a sort of parchment from the intestines of sheep, very far from transparent. The bedding was composed of dry hay, thrown into 2 long red wooden boxes, ornamented with sentences painted in Icelandic. I really had no idea that we should be made so comfortable. There was one objection to the house, and that was the very powerful odor of dried fish, of macerated meat, and of sour milk, which 3 fragrances combined did not at all suit my olfactory nerves. As soon as we had freed ourselves from our heavy traveling costume, the voice of our host was heard calling to us to come into the kitchen, the only room in which the Icelanders ever make any fire, no matter how cold it may be. My uncle, nothing loath, hastened to obey this hospitable and friendly invitation. I followed. The kitchen chimney was made on an antique model, A large stone standing in the middle of the room was the fireplace. Above, in the roof, was a hole for the smoke to pass through. This apartment was kitchen, parlor, and dining room, all in one. On our entrance, our worthy host, as if he had not seen us before, advanced ceremoniously, uttered a word which means "be happy," and then kissed both of us on the cheek. His wife followed, pronounced the same word with the same ceremonial. Then the husband and wife, placing their right hands upon their hearts, bowed profoundly. This excellent Icelandic woman was the mother of 19 children, who, little and big, rolled, crawled, and walked about in the midst of volumes of smoke arising from the angular fireplace in the middle of the room. Every now and then I could see a fresh white head, and a slightly melancholy expression of countenance, peering at me through the vapor. Both my uncle and myself, however, were very friendly with the whole party, and before we were aware of it, there were 3 or 4 of these little ones on our shoulders, as many on our boxes, and the rest hanging about our legs. Those who could speak kept crying out "Sail Virtue" in every possible and impossible key. Those who did not speak only made all the more noise. This concert was interrupted by the announcement of supper. At this moment, our worthy guide, the eider duck hunter, came in after seeing to the feeding and stabling of the horses, which consisted in letting them loose to browse on the stunted green of the Icelandic prairies. There was little for them to eat but moss and some very dry and innutritious grass. Next day they were ready before the door, some time before we were. "Welcome," said Hans. Then, tranquilly, with the air of an automaton, without any more expression in one kiss than another, he embraced the host and hostess and their 19 children. This ceremony concluded to the satisfaction of all parties. We all sat down to table, that is, 24 of us, somewhat crowded. Those who were best off had only 2 juveniles on their knees. As soon, however, as the inevitable soup was placed on the table, the natural taciturny, common even in Icelandic babies, prevailed over all else. Our host filled our plates with a portion of lichen soup, of Iceland moss, of by no means disagreeable flavor, an enormous lump of fish floating in sour butter. After that, there came some skyr, a kind of curds and whey, served with biscuits and juniper berry juice. To drink, we had blanda, skimmed milk with water. I was hungry, so hungry that by way of dessert, I finished up with a basin of thick oaten porridge. As soon as the meal was over, the children disappeared, whilst the grown people sat around the fireplace, on which was placed turf, heather, cow dung, and dry fish bones. As soon as everybody was sufficiently warm, a general dispersion took place, all retiring to their respective couches. Our hostess offered to pull off our stockings and trousers according to the custom of the country, but we graciously declined to be so honored. She left us to our bed of dry fodder. Next day, at 5 a.m, we took our leave of these hospitable peasants. My uncle had great difficulty in making them accept a sufficient and proper remuneration. Hans then gave them the signal to start. We had scarcely got 100 yards from Gardar when the character of the country changed. The soil began to be marshy and boggy and less favorable to progress. To the right, the range of mountains was prolonged indefinitely like a great system of natural fortifications, of which we skirted the glacis. We met with numerous streams and rivulets, which it was necessary to ford, and that without wetting our baggage. As we advanced, the deserted appearance increased, and yet now and then we could see human shadows flitting in the distance. When a sudden turn of the track brought us within easy reach of one of these specters, I felt a sudden impulse of disgust at the sight of a swollen head with shining skin, utterly without hair, and whose repulsive and revolting wounds could be seen through his rags. The unhappy wretches never came forward to beg. On the contrary, they ran away. Not so quick, however, but that Hans was able to salute them with the universal "Sail Virtue." "Spedalsk," he said. "A leper," explained my uncle. The very sound of such a word caused a feeling of repulsion. The horrible affliction known as leprosy, which had almost vanished before the effects of modern science, is common in Iceland. It is not contagious, but hereditary, so that marriage is strictly prohibited to these unfortunate creatures. These poor lepers did not tend to enliven our journey, the scene of which was inexpressibly sad and lonely. The very last tufts of grassy vegetation appeared to die at our feet. Not a tree was to be seen except a few stunted willows about as big as blackberry bushes. Now and then we watched a falcon soaring in the gray and misty air, taking his flight towards warmer and sunnier regions. I could not help feeling a sense of melancholy come over me. I sighed for my own native land and wished to be back with Gretchen. We were compelled to cross several little fjords, and at last came to a real gulf. The tide was at its height, and we were able to go over at once and reach the hamlet of Alftanes about a mile farther. That evening, after fording the Alpha and the Hedda, 2 rivers rich in trout and pike, we were compelled to pass the night in a deserted house, worthy of being haunted by all the fays of Scandinavian mythology. The King of Cold had taken up his residence there and made us feel his presence all night. The following day was remarkable by its lack of any particular incidents. Always the same damp and swampy soil, the same dreary uniformity, the same sad and monotonous aspect of scenery. In the evening, having accomplished the half of our projected journey, we slept at the annexia of Krozulpt. For a whole mile we had under our feet nothing but lava. This disposition of the soil is called hran. The crumbled lava on the surface was in some instances like ship cables stretched out horizontally, and others coiled in heaps. An immense field of lava came from the neighboring mountains, all extinct volcanoes, but whose remains showed what once they had been. Here and there could be made out the steam from hot water springs. There was no time, however, for us to take more than a cursory view of these phenomena. We had to go forward with what speed we might. Soon the soft and swampy soil again appeared under the feet of our horses, while at every 100 yards we came upon 1 or more small lakes. Our journey was now in a westerly direction. We had, in fact, swept round the great bay of Faxa, and the twin white summits of Sneffels rose to the clouds at a distance of less than 5 miles. The horses now advanced rapidly. The accidents and difficulties of the soil no longer checked them. I confess that fatigue began to tell severely upon me, but my uncle was as firm and as hard as he had been on the first day. I could not help admiring both the excellent professor and the worthy guide, for they appeared to regard this rugged expedition as a mere walk. On Saturday, the 20th June, at 6 o'clock in the evening, we reached Budir, a small town picturesquely situated on the shore of the ocean, and here the guide asked for his money. My uncle settled with him immediately. It was now the family of Hans himself, that is to say, his uncles, his cousins, German, who offered us hospitality. We were exceedingly well received, and without taking too much advantage of the goodness of those worthy people, I should have liked very much to have rested with them after the fatigues of the journey. But my uncle, who did not require rest, had no idea of anything of the kind, and despite the fact that the next day was Sunday, I was compelled once more to mount my steed. The soil was again affected by the neighborhood of the mountains, whose granite peered out of the ground like tops of an old oak. We were skirting the enormous base of the mighty volcano. My uncle never took his eyes from off it. He could not keep from gesticulating and looking at it with a kind of sullen defiance, as much as to say, "That is the giant I have made up my mind to conquer." After 4 hours of steady traveling, the horses stopped of themselves before the door of the presbytery of Stapi. Chapter 11. We reach Mount Sneffels, the Reykir. Stapi is a town consisting of 30 huts, built on a large plain of lava exposed to the rays of the sun reflected from the volcano. It stretches its humble tenements along the end of a little fjord, surrounded by a basaltic wall of the most singular character. Basalt is a brown rock of igneous origin. It assumes regular forms which astonish by their singular appearance. Here we found nature proceeding geometrically and working quite after a human fashion, as if she had employed the plummet line, the compass, and the rule. If elsewhere she produces grand artistic effects by piling up huge masses without order or connection, if elsewhere we see truncated cones and perfect pyramids with an odd succession of lines, here, as if wishing to give a lesson in regularity, and preceding the architects of the early ages, she has erected a severe order of architecture, which neither the splendors of Babylon nor the marvels of Greece ever surpassed. I had often heard of the Giant's Causeway in Ireland, and of Fingal's Cave in one of the Hebrides, but the grand spectacle of a real basaltic formation had never yet come before my eyes. This at Stapi gave us an idea of one in all its wonderful beauty and grace. The wall of the fjord, like nearly the whole of the peninsula, consisted of a series of vertical columns in height about 30 feet. These upright pillars of stone of the finest proportion supported an archivolt of horizontal columns which formed a sort of half-vaulted roof above the sea. At certain intervals, and below this natural basin, the eye was pleased and surprised by the sight of oval openings through which the outward waves came thundering in volleys of foam. Some banks of basalt, torn from their fastenings by the fury of the waves, lay scattered on the ground like the ruins of an ancient temple, ruins eternally young, over which the storms of ages swept without producing any perceptible effect. This was the last stage of our journey. Hans had brought us along with fidelity and intelligence, and I began to feel somewhat more comfortable when I reflected that he was to accompany us still farther on our way. When we halted before the house of the rector, a small and incommodious cabin, neither handsome nor more comfortable than those of his neighbors, I saw a man in the act of shoeing a horse, a hammer in his hand and a leathern apron tied around his waist. "Be happy," said the eider-down hunter, using his national salutation in his own language. "God dag, good day," replied the former, in excellent Danish. "KatuhClysmic," cried Hans, turning round and introducing him to my uncle. "The rector," repeated the worthy professor. "It appears, my dear Harry, that this worthy man is the rector, and is not above doing his own work." During the speaking of these words, the guide intimated to the KatuhClysmic what was the true state of the case. The good man, ceasing from his occupation, gave a kind of hello, upon which a tall woman, almost a giantess, came out of the hut. She was at least 6 feet high, which in that region is something considerable. My first impression was one of horror. I thought she had come to give us the Icelandic kiss. I had, however, nothing to fear, for she did not even show much inclination to receive us into her house. The room devoted to strangers appeared to me to be by far the worst in the presbytery. It was narrow, dirty, and offensive. There was, however, no choice about the matter. The rector had no notion of practicing the usual cordial and antique hospitality. Far from it. Before the day was over, I found we had the deal of a blacksmith, a fisherman, a hunter, a carpenter, anything but a clergyman. It must be said in his favor that we had caught him on a weekday. Probably he appeared to greater advantage on the Sunday. These poor priests receive from the Danish government a most ridiculously inadequate salary, and collect 1/4 of the tithe of their parish, not more than 60 marks current, or about L310s, sterling. Hence the necessity of working to live. In truth, we soon found that our host did not count civility among the cardinal virtues. My uncle soon became aware of the kind of man he had to deal with. Instead of a worthy and learned scholar, he found a dull, ill-mannered peasant. He therefore resolved to start on his great expedition as soon as possible. He did not care about fatigue, and resolved to spend a few days in the mountains. The preparations for our departure were made the very next day after our arrival at Stapi. Hans now hired 3 Icelanders to take the place of the horses, which could no longer carry our luggage. When, however, these worthy islanders had reached the bottom of the crater, they were to go back and leave us to ourselves. This point was settled before they would agree to start. On this occasion, my uncle partly confided in Hans, the eider-duck hunter, and gave him to understand that it was his intention to continue his exploration of the volcano to the last possible limits. Hans listened calmly, and then nodded his head. To go there or elsewhere, to bury himself in the bowels of the earth or to travel over its summits, was all the same to him. As for me, amused and occupied by the incidents of travel, I had begun to forget the inevitable future. But now I was once more destined to realize the actual state of affairs. What was to be done? Run away? If I really had intended to leave Professor Hardwigg to his fate, it should have been in Hamburg and not at the foot of Sneffels. One idea, above all others, began to trouble me. A very terrible idea, and one calculated to shake the nerves of a man even less sensitive than myself. "Let us consider the matter," I said to myself. "We are going to ascend the Sneffels mountain. Well and good. We are about to pay a visit to the very bottom of the crater. Good still. Others have done it and did not perish from that course. That, however, is not the whole matter to be considered. If a road does really present itself by which to descend into the dark and subterraneous bowels of Mother Earth, if this thrice unhappy Saknussem has really told the truth, we shall be most certainly lost in the midst of the labyrinth of subterraneous galleries of the volcano. Now we have no evidence to prove that Sneffels is really extinct. What proof have we that an eruption is not shortly about to take place? Because the monster has slept soundly since 1219 does not follow that he is never to wake. If he does wake, what is to become of us?" These were questions worthy thinking about, and upon them I reflected long and deeply. I could not lie down in search of sleep without dreaming of eruptions. The more I thought, the more I objected to be reduced to the state of dross and ashes. I could stand it no longer, so I determined at last to submit the whole case to my uncle, in the most adroit manner possible, and under the form of some totally irreconcilable hypothesis. I sought him. I laid before him my fears, and then drew back in order to let him get his passion over at ease. "I have been thinking about the matter," he said, in the quietest tone in the world. What did he mean? Was he at last about to listen to the voice of reason? Did he think of suspending his projects? It was almost too much happiness to be true. I, however, made no remark. In fact, I was only too anxious not to interrupt him, and allowed him to reflect at his leisure. After some moments, he spoke out. "I have been thinking about the matter," he resumed. "Ever since we have been at Stapi, my mind has been almost solely occupied with the grave question which has been submitted to me by yourself, for nothing would be unwiser and more inconsistent than to act with imprudence." "I heartily agree with you, my dear uncle," was my somewhat hopeful rejoinder. "It is now 600 years since Sneffel has spoken, but though now reduced to a state of utter silence, he may speak again. New volcanic eruptions are always preceded by perfectly well-known phenomena. I have closely examined the inhabitants of this region. I have carefully studied the soil, and I beg to tell you emphatically, my dear Harry, there will be no eruption at present." As I listened to his positive affirmations, I was stupefied and could say nothing. "I see you doubt my word," said my uncle. "Follow me." I obeyed mechanically. Leaving the presbytery, the professor took a road through an opening in the basaltic rock, which led far away from the sea. We were soon in open country, if we could give such a name to a place all covered with volcanic deposits. The whole land seemed crushed under the weight of enormous stones, of trap, of basalt, of granite, of lava, and of all other volcanic substances. I could see many spouts of steam rising in the air. These white vapors, called in the Icelandic language raker, came from hot water fountains, and indicate by their violence the volcanic activity of the soil. Now the sight of these appeared to justify my apprehension. I was, therefore, all the more surprised and mortified when my uncle thus addressed me. "You see all this smoke, Harry, my boy?" "Yes, sir." "Well, as long as you see them thus, you have nothing to fear from the volcano." "How can that be?" "Be careful to remember this," continued the professor. "At the approach of an eruption, these spouts of vapor redouble their activity, to disappear altogether during the period of volcanic eruption, for the elastic fluids, no longer having the necessary tension, seek refuge in the interior of the crater, instead of escaping through the fissures of the earth. If then the steam remains in its normal and habitual state, if their energy does not increase, and if you add to this the remark that the wind is not replaced by heavy atmospheric pressure and dead calm, you may be quite sure that there is no fear of any immediate eruption. But enough, my boy. When science has sent forth her fiat, it is only to hear and obey." I came back to the house quite downcast and disappointed. My uncle had completely defeated me with his scientific arguments. Nevertheless, I had still one hope, and that was, when once we were at the bottom of the crater, that it would be impossible in default of a gallery or tunnel to descend any deeper, and this, despite all the learned Saknussems in the world. I passed the whole of the following night with a nightmare on my chest, and after unheard of miseries and tortures, found myself in the very depths of the earth, from which I was suddenly launched into planetary space under the form of an eruptive rock. Next day, June 23rd, Hans calmly awaited us outside the presbytery with his 3 companions loaded with provisions, tools, and instruments. 2 iron-shod poles, 2 guns, and 2 large game bags were reserved for my uncle and myself. Hans, who was a man who never forgot even the minutest precautions, had added to our baggage a large skin full of water, as an addition to our gourds. This assured us water for 8 days. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when we were quite ready. The rector and his huge wife, or servant, never knew which, stood at the door to see us off. They appeared to be about to inflict on us the usual final kiss of the Icelanders. To our supreme astonishment, their adieu took the shape of a formidable bill, in which they even counted the use of the pastoral house, really and truly the most abominable and dirty place I ever was in. The worthy couple cheated and robbed us like a Swiss innkeeper, and made us feel by the sum we had to pay the splendors of their hospitality. My uncle, however, paid without bargaining. A man who had made up his mind to undertake a voyage into the interior of the earth is not the man to haggle over a few miserable riksdollars. This important matter settled, Hans gave the signal for departure, and some few moments later, we had left Stapi.